Sporer. I'm at IBM Almaden Research Center, where I'm a researcher and scientist there. But I'm also the co-founder of the EOE, which stands for Educational Object Economy. And Doug has asked me to say a few words about education. During times of rapid change, the requirements of lifelong learning are self-evident. The Department of Education tells us in reports that the average American entering the workforce today can expect 7 careers in their lifetime. That's not just same job, minor changes. These are radically different careers that people can expect to be involved in. Also, there's probably a lot of technologists and maybe even some folks from the medical profession, which are 2 of the high growth rate areas of jobs. We know that weekly there's updates to the technology, updates to the methods and procedures that we have to use. So we really do see that lifelong learning is an urgent problem that we're facing. The National Association of Businesses has said that the #1 problem facing businesses today is getting qualified workers. Education and learning are critically important for national competitiveness in a global economy, as Doug has already said. So among us here, we probably hold it as pretty self-evident that lifelong learning is a critical need of the world today. Now, in trying to explore what can we do to improve the state of education, what can we do to improve learning, the National Science Foundation funded me to do a project a few years ago that is called the EOE, or Educational Object Economy. And what we did is we created a large directory of educational software online. That's not all we did. We made sure that the educational software was largely open source Java applications. And we also freely distributed the tools and techniques that we had created to create our online community. We shared them with anyone that wanted them. And the purpose of the exploration was really to promote sharing and adding value. And let's look at that for a minute, promote sharing and adding value. If you think about it, one of the great things about open source is that it allows other people to add value to the work that you've done. So we really sought out educational software that was open source. And partly that's because a lot of the educational software that's out there may not be quite right for some educator or teacher's needs. If it's open source, it can be modified more easily. It can be changed. It can be upgraded. And this experiment has led to several interesting things that I'll tell you about in a minute, but the point was really, how do we work together collectively? And this is a common theme in Doug's work. How do we work together collectively to make a difference? How can we make the individual actions that we do collectively add up to something bigger? And a little bit of motivation is that the work that I've been doing prior to creating the EOE was creating authoring tools. And we created some wonderful authoring tools that would help teachers create educational software. And what we discovered when we gave those authoring tools to the world is the physics department over here at this university used the tools to create a pendulum simulation. The physics department over here at this other university used the tools to create a pendulum simulation. And we had 15 or 16 pendulum simulations. We had lots and lots of redundancy in the educational objects that were being created. So there was a real inefficiency. And the EOE tries to address this inefficiency by creating an online website that people can post their objects to. So what's the first thing you should do when you're going to create an educational object? Go to the EOE or some other dynamic knowledge repository for educational objects. It doesn't have to just be the EOE. And see if it already exists. Because if it's already there, taking it out of the EOE is going to be much, much faster than using even the best authoring tools in the world to create this. Now the EOE, when we created it, we wanted it to be free. So all of the educational objects that are there are totally free for anybody in the world to go to and use. We also wanted to motivate people, though, to put their material into the EOE. And what we discovered was a very powerful motivator was attribution. So anytime anybody uses anything from the EOE, we have a requirement. You have to give attribution. And that goes for the EOE itself. So we have an original, well, you can go to the website there, www.eoe.org, to see the original EOE. But a wonderful thing happened. We created the EOE, and we gave it away for free. And other people started taking it and improving it, making it better, and carrying it light years beyond what we at EOE headquarters had even envisioned. One of the first organizations to pick it up was the California State University system. And they created a statewide education object economy that has lots and lots of educational resources. In fact, they have over 10 times the number of educational resources in their dynamic knowledge repository than we have in the EOE. So that just goes to show the multiplying effect that when you give something away that other people can use that's valuable and harnesses the collective potential of lots of people, they were able to harness the collective potential of the California State University system to build up a much, much larger knowledge repository. We also had another organization called JCampus, which used the tool that we gave away for free. And they set up a worldwide organization for computer science departments to promote Java education in these computer science departments. They have hundreds and hundreds of members from all around the world. And I really encourage you to go to these websites if you get a chance and look at the power of creating a tool that you can give away that other people can add value to in their own unique way. And we've even had people use the tool for other things different from education. So it was an interesting experiment. And it's even been used for commercial learning sites as well. So I just wanted to briefly give you a sense of, here's an example of a improvement community that's out there for education. And there's lots of them. This is just one. So there's a larger issue, of course. So the larger issue is boosting collective IQ. And Doug, in his talk, has said, here we are in this room, or around the world listening. Is there some way that we can start working together on some of these problems that Doug has outlined? So what I'd like to do in the remainder of the talk, that'll be pretty brief, is just to tell you a little bit about some of the thinking that I've been doing in light of the input that Doug has given me about boosting collective IQ. Now, there's two parts to boosting collective IQ, as I see it. One is boosting the individual IQ, which is primarily the work that the EOE is focusing on. And the other is really thinking about collective IQ, making organizations that think better. And in terms of boosting individual IQ, I have these 6 R's of learning that I'd like to refer to. And the 6 R's are reminding, remediation, receiving, reconstruction, research, and reflection. And these 6 R's group into 3 types of learning. The first two, reminding and remediation, deal with the situation where you, the individual, you knew the knowledge at one point and just you can't remember it. A problem that I share with Doug, remembering things at times. I like to turn off my cell phone when I come into a meeting. Remediation, which is practicing skills and habits. You know, I know how to do something, but I haven't done it in a while. I better rehearse it and practice it. But the knowledge did exist, the skill did exist in me at one point. It's just, it's not fresh. Then the next two is when the knowledge has never been in my head before, but it's been in someone else's head. And this is where you start getting into the notion of collective IQ. I haven't known this information, but you have, and I'm in a situation where I need it right away. This is the training situation. I want to receive the knowledge from you as quickly and as efficiently as I can. Then there's reconstruction, which is more like education. This is a situation where you've got some knowledge in your head. I'd like to have it in my head, but I'm not under a time pressure to use the knowledge. What's more important to me is that I learn something deep about the knowledge, something that's going to allow me to apply it in the future in some flexible way that we can't determine right now. So training and education. And then the last two, research and reflection. This is when the knowledge has never existed in anybody's head on the planet. Okay, and research is, we've got a question, nobody knows the answer to this question. The knowledge has never existed in anybody's head on the planet. So we've got to find that new answer. Now reflection is interesting, and this is in some sense the highest form, and this is what Doug does very, very well. is it's asking the new questions. What are the new paradigms? What are the new problems that we should be working on? So the 6 R's are, I like to think of them in terms of what can we do for collective IQ. The ultimate solution, and Doug, correct me if this seems wrong, is that ideally, and we're nowhere near this, but ideally, anything that any one of us learns, the rest of us should have. That would be the ideal. Total efficiency. So if Dave Singer, who's also at IBM, learns something about a standard that he's watching, if I knew that immediately, instantly, and effortlessly, that would be the ideal of some sort of collective learning. Now, there are people who actually envision techniques for that, but we won't get into those today. But here's, this is the kind of thing that I believe Doug, when he's asking for help, he's looking for people who are willing to work together to take some of these ideas and flesh them out, take them in new directions, and iterate. So that's what I'm giving some examples of. Now, the even larger issue, so we started with lifelong learning, which in some sense, most of the work that's going on right now is not about collective IQ building. It's about how to make you learn something faster, individual learning. So then the larger issue beyond just individual learning is collective IQ. And then even beyond that is improving the capability infrastructure. And this is really about the coevolution of the human system and the tool system. You can think about when individuals or groups of people learn something that's evolving the human system. But when we get the tool system involved, then there's an interesting dynamic. And I like to tell one story that, for me at least, makes this human system, tool system coevolution salient, which is, how many of you know about the Apple Newton in handwriting recognition? Okay. That's right. Somebody in here has one. And I'm sure you all know about Palm Pilot. Well, there's an interesting thing. Apple created the Newton, and they made a gamble that handwriting recognition technology was good enough. And if it is good enough, what does that mean? It means it's easier for people to learn how to use this device. Palm made a bet. And they said, handwriting recognition isn't ready. We need to invent something. Let's call it graffiti, that will allow people who are smart to learn something in maybe a half hour, an hour, that will allow them to take notes on this device. 2 approaches. One said, the tool system is ready. Let's bring it to market. The other said, the tool system isn't ready, but the human system's ready. Let's bring it to market. Now, neither one is an ideal solution. I mean, handwriting recognition that doesn't work, but so-so, is a tool that some people use today. So it's got to have some value. And graffiti, while it's wonderfully easy to learn for some people, still is a barrier that prevents its adoption more widely. So I think that's a nice example of this human system, tool system coevolution. And if we look at the, one of the things that I've been thinking about quite a bit, and once again, this is in the mode of, Doug has posed some problems and I want to think about them. So I'm sharing with you some of the thoughts that I've had on them. The improving the capability infrastructure is a big, big problem. I mean, Doug said we need some people who've studied the evolution of technological and social developments through the years to even begin to get a picture of this enormous evolution that's occurred. But the thing that I've been focusing on recently is what are the drivers for that capability infrastructure improvement. And some of the drivers are the basic needs and wants, both individual and collective, that people have. So my analysis is I'm starting to look at these various needs and wants and see how they map onto different infrastructures that have been developed. And some of the basic infrastructures, I've just listed some here. The defense, legal, government infrastructures, these are amazing. These, the evolution of laws and, I think the first written laws were, and somebody will correct me, were some of the early Persian laws that said if you are caught stealing, we cut off your hand. And that had an effect on society, the codification of those laws. Medicine and education, I've told you a little bit about why I perceive education as one of the most urgent and complex problems. It's this rate of change that's increasing, and how do we get enough people to maintain our aircraft? How do we get enough people to teach the material in the schools? This is a really critical problem. Financial and retail. This deals with value exchange, energy, water, sewage infrastructures, energy and the transportation of matter, transportation and entertainment, media and communication, the transport of information, agriculture, natural resources, and manufacturing and construction. Just like the EOE is for education, Doug envisions a world where we've got collective efforts working in all of these areas. We've got improvement communities that are thinking about, the science of shopping. How do we make shopping better? Actually, I just read a great book by that title, The Science of Shopping, recently, that's fascinating. And some of the work that we're doing in my group at IBM, which has some interesting complexities on, is a technology for tracking what people are looking at. So we've got companies that are interested in, they put up an advertisement and they wonder, well, how many people looked at it? How long did they look at it? Can you tell us something about the demographics of the people that were looking at it? Was it kids? Was it adults? And we've got technology that does this. Now, there are a host of issues around this, right? Privacy concerns are probably the highest on the list. But we're creating technologies at Almaden, for example, that within a decade, within this form factor, will have enough storage to record all the audio in your life. So my 9-year-old, when he goes to college, is going to be able to record all of the audio lectures and probably take some pictures and capture things in the life. That's an amazing thing that's going to be here in 10 years. What are the consequences of that? Privacy is a main one. I mean, someone who's got devices like this and can be recording everything that happens in their life. Well, what if something about your life intersects their life and you don't want it shared? These are some of the things that we're going to have to deal with. Now, how do we deal with those? Well, it's over here in the legal area, in the government area. There's going to have to be new laws that protect privacy and information. Those laws have to co-evolve, and organizations that enforce those laws, organizations that monitor, they all have to co-evolve. One other nice example while I'm holding this of the co-evolution of technology and law is by 2001, all phones have to become location aware, all mobile phones. Right now, if I make a 911 call on this phone, they don't know where I am. It goes off to some state. It doesn't even go to the local 911. It goes to some state 911 number. And I have to tell them. Well, a lot of 911 calls, the people aren't clear about where they are, and the emergency things get sent out wrong. So there's a new law. Because we now have this mobile communication technology, we need a law that tells the manufacturers who are building this technology, you have to build location sense, location awareness into these technologies. So I'm going to end here, but what I've done is to, in a very short amount of time, and I'd be happy to talk to you more and in greater depth on any of these things, give you a sense of some of the issues that I'm personally working on and trying to get some of my colleagues at IBM interested in working with Doug on, and of course the EOE organization, our education research nonprofit. The urgent issue of lifelong learning, how do we boost the collective IQ, and how do we think about this larger issue of the improving capabilities infrastructure and this co-evolution of the human and tool system that has to occur. So I'm going to end here, and I'd like to introduce Hugh Crane to tell us a little bit about energy.
I'm the honest engineer that Doug referred to earlier, of 43 years ago. But when he hit me with that number, I just ricocheted a little bit, and then I had to think that 10 years before that, I worked on one of the first big computers of IBM that worked at a whole 25 instructions a second, tons of relays and vacuum tubes, and device density was measured in cubic inches per bit. And it was hard to think that in one person's lifetime, to have been involved with that and to see what we have today. And Doug mentioned another thing about ant colonies, which made me think. I quickly tried to reconstruct some numbers I once did. The E.O. Wilson, the Harvard ant-man, if I'd be maybe a little casual, estimates, as I remember, that the number of ants on Earth is 10 to the 16th or 10 to the 17th. And massaging some of Gordon Moore's numbers a couple of years ago and extrapolating to today, I can't believe that the number of transistors, equivalent transistors, produced per year today is less than 10 to the 17th or 18th. There are more transistors being produced than there are ants on Earth. But now if you want to do it per capita, it gets kind of interesting, because you take that number and divide it by 6 billion people, and they're approaching 10 million transistors per capita per year. It doesn't matter per year. It's growing so fast, all the other hardly matters. It's only last year's production. Okay, let's move on. Let's see. We got to go faster now. Ed Kinderman, he spoke to you last week. Here's a summary of some of the things he said. Energy is essential to modern industry, modern world. No energy, no rooms, no internet, no lights, no cars, no nothing. Energy is under everything. But there's some really dangerous things happening. We live on fossil fuels, but they're very limited and being used at an ever faster rate. And the thing that's most scary is there's good talk about alternative energies. They're going to be extremely difficult to implement. Now, in a word, the way we got started on this, Ed Kinderman is even older than me.
10 years.
He's started in the early 1940s on isotope separation and has been in the world of energy ever since, has been in practically every phase of it. I have no background whatsoever in the world and just happened to stumble across a new unit that we think is going to make quite a difference, a unit of measure. I won't take the time how that came about, but I'll show you in what sense we're creating a view. We've been at the book now for about 6 years and it's coming to fruition. It's like cleaning the windows on such a complex system, this global energy system. This new unit is like cleaning the glass, and you can see, and you'll see in a moment what I mean by that. Now let's see how this goes. Now, the current world of energy, it's such an old business. It has evolved an enormous range of units of all sorts that are used, say, for oil, coal, and gas, plus dozens of other units. Just to keep track of the units or to be able to communicate is a real chore. I won't even try and explain what some of those are. In our enterprise, we've used only one unit, a cubic mile. Now, never mind how that came about. Well, it came about, yeah, I'll tell you how it came about. I was sitting in a long gas line with a lot of other people here in the early 70s, almost 30 years ago, and I said, I wonder how much oil we use. So I thumbed around and looked, and it was getting close to 1 trillion gallons per year. And I said, 1 trillion. It's not 1 million, it's not 1 billion, it's 1 trillion. I said, is that a lot? Compared to what? And it turns out, massaging a lot of ways to look at it, a cubic mile, a mile by a mile by a mile, contains 10 to the 11th, 1 trillion gallons, close to it. I said, that's interesting. We're using a cubic mile of oil per year. Wasn't at that time, not quite, but today we are passing through, it's continually increasing. Production this year is 1 cubic mile of oil and still growing. Now, all right, let's see, where are we going from here? Now, oil, you say, gee, why should you build a unit on oil? Well, it just happened to be a very convenient unit. But oil is very special, and unless people really understand it, we can continue to waste it as we do. Oil can power a child's aircraft and the biggest jet flying, the same fuel. Don't look forward to solar panels on the wings or nuclear reactors on the inside, or even coal-burning fires on the inside to power anything. Oil is very special. So the fact we use it, a unit based on it, is very appropriate. Now, let's see why this babble of units that we all live in now, people involved in energy, is so confusing. On the left, for example, there's some numbers. So many gallons per second, that's per second. So many gallons of oil, so many tons of coal, etc. And if I said to you, what's the total? You wouldn't have the foggiest idea. How do you add non-compatible things? All right? Everything we do, everything is in terms of CMO, cubic miles of oil, or heat equivalent. You'll see no other unit. So there it is. Oil is one CMO per year, and there's coal and gas. 2.1. 2.1 units are being consumed annually today of fossil fuel. Well, what else is there? Alternatives. Well, what about alternatives? There's on the top 3 rows is the same numbers you just saw, 2.1 CMO. In the solar world, the only technology of any significance is hydropower, which has been around for a long time, hydroelectric power. And that makes about the equivalent of 0.2. And then there's biomass, which is commercial biomass, very small. And photovoltaic, wind, and solar thermal, meaning these kind of fields that concentrate light, solar light, and make heat, high temperature energy, are insignificant for all of the hype of all the windmills here and in Norway and here in the West. The total production of all solar alternative energy is irrelevant. And you'll shudder when I show you a few pictures of what it might cost and the complexity of building that system. Nuclear fission is also about 0.2. And there are other things, wave power and tidal power and OTEC. There's so many things, but they're all on the drawing boards. They're all researchy. The only one else I mention is geothermal, steam underground, which derives, incidentally, from the cooling, molten core of the Earth, plus radioactivity within the Earth, generates an outflow of approximately 7 CMO per year of energy. Comes out from the center of the Earth. We only capture less than 0.01 CMO. It's hard to get this energy. There's a lot around, but it's hard to get it. There's the world, 2.5 units. You don't have to worry about billions, trillions, quadrillions. There's 2.5 units. Everything we talk about on an annual basis, you can use the fingers of one hand. You don't have to be confused, as many articles are, saying trillions when they mean billions. Who cares? The factor of 1,000, they're so big, no one understands when there are errors made in articles. So there we have 2.5. How did we get there? Starting from about 1900, it was about 0.2. We're now up to 2.5. That dotted curve is an averaged out exponential. It's compounding at a rate of 2.6% per year for 100 years. So we're up to 2.5. So essentially a 12-fold increase. The amount of energy consumed to date, up to year 2000, has been about 90 CMO, of which about 40 was oil taken out of the ground. 40 cubic miles of oil removed from the ground. Now, if that rate continued at that 2.6% per year, by 2050...
You want to use this and you can point at the screen.
Okay. By 2050... Well, by 2050, we'd be up to about 9 CMO per year. the equivalent of 9 oil industries. Wait till I show you some numbers, how big, what that means. There's no way we're going to reach 9 CMO per year. Okay. So the question is, how are we going to constrain things and turn them around? And how are we going to get through this 50 years? As I say, energy is not a subject that's on the radar screen. There's no concern. There's no public concern about this issue. It's a very complicated, critical issue. The UN has meetings on women's rights and the environment and population and so on. Not yet until we really push on them to get energy on the radar screen, because we have no sense that it's even important. All right? Now, forget all these numbers. I'll just tell you what. If you look here, we'll start with Japan, which isn't listed. Japan has no energy resources, essentially zero. You move into Western Europe, these numbers here are when the conservative estimates of how much oil is left, when it would run out. Western Europe, which has very little, will run out, depending on certain assumptions, within 5 to 10 or 15 years. Out. Okay. North America isn't much better, but a little better. We don't have much left. Most of the oil taken to date since the Industrial Revolution came out of the United States, 40 CMO. There's only a few left. So, we're approaching some very dangerous times very fast, and the alternatives do not look very thrilling. Now, it's not only just numbers. There's a very severe international questions involved here too, because there's a great mismatch between where energy is used in the developed world now and where it comes from. This is the amount, conservative estimate, of how much is left worldwide of oil, gas, coal. Now, boy, these pictures have all changed. Oil, this is the way the world is broken up by districts. The Middle East, not surprised to anyone here, has most of it, a one-lump model. Gas comes in 2 lumps. In the Middle East, oh my God, in the Middle East, these have gotten all loused up in getting into the computer here. Gas is in 2 big lumps, oh, I see. No. And coal is in 3 big lumps. Okay. The bottom line is there's a great geopolitical problem here, because where the energy comes from ain't where it's used in the main right now. That there's a naval patrol sort of on permanent duty in the Persian Gulf should be a surprise to no one. They're frightening things ahead. Now, so the situation with the fossil fuels is not very encouraging. Wait till I show you some things about what will be involved in alternatives. The alternatives of solar and nuclear. And there's 5 issues. Cost. There can be significant increase in cost. Land area use, electricity storage for technologies like wind and photovoltaic. See, coal, oil, gas, and nuclear, it comes in stored form. Burn it when you need it. These, you only got it when the wind blows or the sun shines, so there's a tremendous new need for mass, large-scale energy storage. Perception of danger and limited, not very rapid, fast rates of change, which I'll show you. Oh, this has really gotten destroyed. Let's see what we can make out of it. I want to give you an idea of what it takes to make 1 CMO per year of energy. Let's look down here. A nuclear reactor is an average size on the order of 1,000 megawatts. That one belongs over here. You would have to build 1 of these per week for 50 years. 1 nuclear reactor per week for 50 years. And if the first ones are still running after 50 years, you then have the equivalent of a cubic mile of oil that we currently use. Now, just for perspective, how big, suppose we're going to start some new oil industries. Joke, there's not that much around to do it, but what does it take, would it take? You'd have to find the equivalent of a 1,000 megawatt reactor is a 20,000, 27,000 barrel per day field, which is a very big, not a field, but a well. And you'd need one of those a week for 50 years. Now, you sort of hold on to your hat. Let's move down here. Wind machines. The biggest windmills of today, wind machines, are in the order of 10 to 20 stories high. Huge machines. They're in the range more like 1,000 kilowatt or a megawatt. So in other words, this is more like 1,000 megawatts. This is only 1 megawatt. Not surprising, you'd have to build 1,500 windmills per week for 50 years to make the equivalent of 1 CMO of energy. Well, you see what kind of land area it will take up. If you don't think that's a major undertaking that will take, not exactly relying on the free market to move on its own into such risky things, well, you see cost in a moment. Talk photovoltaic panels. Of the typical 4x8 sheet of photovoltaic panels, they're only in the 200 watt range. 12 million per week for 50 years. 1,200 per week for 50 years. Let's move on. We're going to get through these fast, in fact. Okay. Cost. Let's do it quickly. The entire oil industry today, if you just look at the cost of refineries itself, which is the largest component, 1 trillion gallons. If you look at the numbers here, see, I can't read them here, so... yeah, no, take photovoltaics, 10 trillion and possibly, probably conservative. So you look at these numbers much higher. Oil comes cheap. The technology is cheap. We're talking many factors increase. Okay, got to go faster. Land. For reference, look down here. The U.S. about 3 million square miles, and if you about 2 million acres, 2 million square miles of all sorts of crop, pasture, and forest lands. Look at commercial biomass. That means growing trees for energy use. 2 million square miles? In fact, it's worse than that because that's just to make raw biomass. But biomass has no use until you convert it into some kind of fuel. And that often comes at a 50% efficiency or even less. Tremendous land areas required. The coal and uranium come in volumetric form, and these are spread out. Might be interesting, we were talking about numbers before. If you take a cubic mile of oil and spread it over the world, it would make a film less than 1 mil thick. And if you take a reserve of, say, 50 CMO reserve, it's equivalent to a few mils thick. All of the remaining energy available is equivalent to a film around the Earth only a few mils thick. And I tell you that only because it gives some idea of why it's so hard to get solar energy. Because it comes in the same spatial aerial form, not volumetric form. So solar is a very difficult path. Now, just a couple of comments on nuclear, because it's very sad. There's some very uninformed, incorrect, in our opinion, ideas out there about certain dangers of nuclear and so on, which is unfortunate because nuclear can and we hope will be an important part to a solution. Let me just make comment on the first two. There's great fear about radiation, and there's great fear about radiation from nuclear accidents, radiation from normal operation nuclear accidents. Let me show you a chart. Natural radiation we all live with. So many units. Let's get down to the things that are related to nuclear, including the Chernobyl accident, which gets so much publicity, got so much, 3 Mile Island and so on. They are in the relative noise compared to natural radiation. Let's take another different kind of look. Dangers to life. Starting with cigarettes, male smokers, 2,200 days lost on average. About 6 years of life on average. You come all the way down this list, and over here is nuclear electricity. One organization says, well, it's 2 days loss, and one is 0.05 days per year. So there might be considerable controversy by a factor of 40 in the irrelevant noise. There's a lot more to say about it, but we've got to keep going. This is to me, one of the most interesting charts. How long it took to develop today's industry. Before the Industrial Revolution, we sort of count from the late 1700s, and it was powered by wood, the native forests. Now this is a plot of shares. The total energy keeps going up, but this is the shares per year. So if you add up all the units, it's 100%. So it took until about 1880 for coal to finally surpass wood at 50% each. 1880. It took till 1940 before oil overtook wood. To our shock when we saw this, it took till 1960. This almost fell off our seats when we saw it. It took that long for oil to pass coal. Now, see, oil is by share is dropping off because finally nuclear is coming up and and gas is coming up. Long times involved in making transitions to major industries. And it surely doesn't happen just because people want it to happen. It can only come by a command decision that we shall do this, because it's going to take enormous sums of money, enormous units of land. How would you even start to make 20 or 30,000 square miles of photocell? You might say, well, you're certainly not going to go all at once because there isn't even long life statistics on these. How many were you willing to bet your life on? Would you start with a square mile? That's huge. A square mile of photocells. You start with acres and so on. But to get up to the kind of numbers we're talking about is staggering. I remind you that the closing here, there's great disparity between who uses energy today and who has it. And that's the seeds of some enormous, difficult international situations going to be facing us. I'll show you this last picture. It's kind of interesting. When I first started in working with Ed 6-7 years ago, I got out, I said, I want to see a list of all the countries. So we had some UN publications of how much energy they use. And your eyes go like this, the numbers without end. So he said, hey, there must be a better way to present this. So he said, look, energy is energy for a unit, a state, a country, is energy per capita times how many capita people. So he said, okay, well, let's make a two-dimensional plot of population versus energy per capita. So every country's a dot. United States, and the unit along here was global average which turns out to be 500 gallons per capita. The world currently uses, on average, 500 gallons per gasoline equivalent per capita, with the United States having about 5 times as much per person. Places like China, at 1/2, is about 10 times less. India is about 20 times less than the United States. So this is most of the consuming countries today, and this is the developed, so to speak, countries. And this is where the big changes are going to be happening, because populations are still increasing and energy use is going up as these countries start to develop. That's where a big problem that's going to face us, which was summarized. We just took a sketch instead of giving you some of our fancy numbers. If you plotted the developing nation group up through, say, 2050, they'll probably be able to control themselves in energy use, and it might actually decrease. But the developing nations, you died. The developing nations are going to, we estimate, pass the developed nations in energy use as early as 2010 or earlier. And that's going to be, this is going to what's going to wag the dog.
Notice that both of them said developing.
It did? You know, something, you didn't get frightened. Oh, gosh. There's something happened in the transition to, I'm sorry, thanks for, you've written the wrong slides here. But this is something we drew yesterday just for fun. We said, hey, this is a big problem. This is one of, you were saying, one of the biggies as far as survival in many ways of modern society. So we said, well, hey, let's name some of the major departments of government from that point of view. What's in it for them? Does it come out of any one? It comes out of all of them. Obviously, the Energy Department has many things to do. Department of the Interior, resolution of major NIMBY, not in my backyard, problems of land, water, and waste issues. I mean, how do you think it'll look when you have thousands of square miles of 20-story windmills that you drive by instead of corn as high as elephant's eye and so on? Big changes coming if we're going to survive as we know it. Commerce Department, promotion of energy efficient technology at home and abroad. There's things in red I'm prepared to say a few things about, but I think we're going to stop anyway. There's some very important things about import policy. State and defense, minimizing energy-related conflict. Put down here, this pre-World War III Marshall Plan. After World War II, we had a Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. One of the great events in history. We better be smart and do the equivalent of a Marshall Plan to avoid World War III by providing the most efficient energy technology to the developing world. We're all going to be in very great trouble. In education, there's some very important things which I'm over time. I'm going to stop right there. If anyone wants to talk about any of these things, I'd be happy to do so.
So all I have to do, does this work? I'd really like to dig down, and if anyone also wants to join in a second. This is a very, very good slide to end with. It's some set of the people that will be involved in the solution. And so how does the solution get driven if the agencies that aren't going to do things unless the fires built under them? I'm pretty sure anyway. But so someplace the driving force has to come from education and awareness out there, which is a paradigm issue. That reminds me, is it working?
Yeah, sorry.
Sort of it made me feel like that's what I've been doing for years. Talking the world and working a microphone. Anyway, so, I don't expect everybody, but for your homework, you're supposed to design a knowledge-based solution to this. You see, why we say that itself is a complex problem, but I think it's something that's very worthwhile in this colloquium to get a snapshot of some of the complex issues and problems there, and realize the way we're sailing along, that's just not getting solved. How many of you, in the last month have heard anything about the energy problem from any other source? Oh, good. But anyway, so it's an issue about how do the salient big problems get put up there in front, and they're competing with what kind of information flow and what kind of urgencies, etc. So one of the problems has to be that we have to find a way for the knowledge to be available, for how you educate our world so that they're aware of it. There's an environmental issue there in this energy situation. Our energy environment is very, very critical. So anyway, I look at that and it could be depressing, but it's like saying, aha. It really is examples are like that. And when Jerry Glenn and Peter Yim, you could have fooled me and just let me go on talking to a dead microphone.
Voice carries so well, we just thought it was on.
Oh. All right. So now I've said everything I want to say, but but Jerry Glenn and Peter are going to go over the problem when is it that he's coming?
He's coming in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks. Okay, so has that list of 15 big issues like that, but then there's another very, very, very important issue that raises in the processes by which he's evolved a way of sort of cultivating the scenario development and the awareness of these things by worldwide knowledge network of people working together to do this, which is a terrific model. And so that's one of the things I hope we don't get sidetracked too much into those 15 bad things and look more into the way in which he's chosen to go about it and the kind of way in which, if we turn into the Nick world, that's a beautiful example of a kind of a Nick. And so could you think of similar examples out here? If they dig down into individual problems, the 15 of them that sounded like any one of them could be as bad as this in there. And, organized crime, for one of them, for instance, getting to be worse more and more. And so you said, okay, how do you solve that with the awareness of the issue? So anyway, we have our hands full of that sort of thing, and what I really like to do is sort of get the dynamics of dialogue about, okay, find a solution. So you said, oh, the frontal attack of this is just overwhelming. Okay, so as in the military, what is there we look at strategically about what could you start doing that would help improve the situation? And you think about, if you've got a very heavy problem, military-wise, there's this whole area you got to take and subdue. So, bash, you could go on the front end or something, but you say, oh, well, wait a minute. If we go and capture this high ground, then we could sweep across and take that, and then that would get us in a position to pick them off one at a time. See, so a strategy like that is something, the kind of thing. So, what we have to think about in a situation like this, because any one of these is almost overwhelming, and it's also overwhelming how you learn how to go after it. So finding a strategic solution is just very, very important, and that's the major thing in this colloquium is we're trying to talk about, is saying, here's a model for a strategic framework that potentially can make an approach like that. Let's either see if we can get that thing moving or get people thinking about what other alternative strategies could be as effective. So that's good. So Hugh and Ed, do you mind telling me who else beside these guys are needing to be part of the solution development?
Well,
certainly one thing, we have a major industry. It's one of the largest in the world. And the people occupied in the various aspects of that industry have to get involved.
So there'll be things like the oil industry
Yeah.
would run out of gas, so to speak,
Yes.
and then if the so if a new industry were nuclear, it'd be a totally different set of skills and investment.
Well, that's not quite true, because at least some of the major players in the nuclear industry are also in the oil industry. Of course, the oil industry is also the gas industry, and to a large extent is the coal industry. They're extracting. They're people who extract fossil fuels from the ground.
I guess I was thinking more about the kind of skills and knowledge it takes to establish and operate the nuclear as contrasted to the other. You'd have to, the same guys aren't going to move over from.
No, they're not going to move over. And another factor that enters into this equation is the nuclear industry is losing its knowledge base. People are retired. People who started my time and even 20 years later are retiring. A lot of the technicians in the United States, and I suspect in other countries, come from the nuclear navies. And the nuclear navies are being cut back. Many of the schools in the United States that started with brave nuclear programs have canceled them, including several years ago, quite a few years ago, Stanford.
I'll make one comment. As I sit here, I really have to apologize.
Nobody can hear you on the web.
I really have to apologize, because I see these are all unreadable. Now, why they got loused up, that's a different problem. But the one under education, from K-12, there's certain thoughts that I could pass on, at least my own thoughts there. But the university, okay, having said I have a long background in the computer industry, I know that starting in the 1960s, late 50s, 60s, early 70s, there was a tremendous push on by a few stalwarts saying, God, we have to go to the universities and get some university departments of computer science. And it was a long push. They struggled very hard until a few broke down. And of course now, today, no respectable university would not have a computer science department, out of which sprung, in much, to a large factor, the industry, the computer industry, like the Silicon Valleys of the world. I suggest that we now need the equivalent of not computer science departments, but global energy departments nationwide, around the world, in fact. And the industry is so huge that I'm sure there would be corresponding kind of spin-offs. But I would add one last thought. There's a fundamental difference between computer science departments from a social point of view and energy departments. Computer science departments grew, but there was no urgency. It just was an opportunity. The world wasn't dying, didn't even know it needed computers. But out of it came computers. The world is in trouble with energy, we believe. And so starting now, so that within 10 years you could start having a stream of really knowledgeable people, real knowledge base. I mean, when you talk knowledge base, it's absolutely missing now. So whereas computer science departments was an opportunity, I suggest that the corresponding energy departments around the world would be a necessity.
Hey, we better solve that. And it's, even if we have to boost our taxes and everything else, we have to do it. Would the management and planning to do that be rather overwhelming? Okay.
Good luck.
No, but otherwise what will happen? I mean, besides the huge political things that will happen if the rich countries get pinched without oil, and they'll go after it no matter what. So besides that kind of thing.
Well, I think if that happens sometime in the future, people will give up a lot of their toys that they have today. There won't be any SUVs for certain.
To John Vasconcellos, I would suggest that California, as the leader of the world, should take this on in a state university system for starters.
See, it must be awful to be a politician.
I'd like to make another comment here. Energy is very slightly on the radar screen. The first two articles in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs deal with energy. The first one is a discussion of how we don't have to worry because we have enough oil. It'll last forever. But slipped into that is we have enough oil for, I think it was 4 trillion gallons. Anyway, they calculate out, and this is the oil not only as oil, but as oil shale, tar sands, and other difficult and environmentally difficult things to get. That's enough if we continue at current rates of use for about 100 years. Nothing left. And the arguments will begin long before that. The other article that's there is a strong defense of nuclear power. A lot of it devoted to explanations of how dirty in wind and photovoltaics are in the way of the waste they generate just in building the facilities, and compare that to the nuclear waste. Of course, everybody has their own point of view, and I noticed that nuclear people didn't talk about the amount of concrete that would have to be built or be used in building containment vessels for nuclear reactors.
I would like to leave you with, as far as I'm concerned, with a question. Do you think, when you think of, say, the intensity of discussion about nuclear power, for example, and a relative few people who have been killed, very small, do you think that if the auto industry was to be proposed today, if it did not exist and it was just being developed, where there are 40,000 deaths per year in the United States alone, and probably several times that in people who were maimed for life, seriously damaged, could you conceive that the auto industry could be permitted to start?
Control of your own destiny.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
The issue is philosophically, the issue is control of your own destiny, so I think it would. But your point is still well taken.
So you need personal nuclear reactors?
No.
Chernobyl happened because the Russians didn't have containment vessels around that set of reactors. Everyone, the rest of the world, all the commercial reactors have containment vessels.
Well, I think it's sort of numbing, isn't it? That you look at a big one like that and says, "Oh, how abstract is a discussion about trying to get the world so we can find the capabilities to handle these things better." So anyway, someplace we have to do it. So I'm going to do us a favor, and for 10 minutes of free time. So it'd be nice to have you spend it here talking to each other and whipping up a solution. And we got some questions or something? Mike, Richard?
Hi, I wondered about how much in cubic miles of oil sunlight do we get in a year?
I told you that what comes out from the Earth is about 7 CMO.
Consume energy. Push your button.
What arrives and is intercepted and enters the atmosphere from solar light is 17,000 CMO per year arrives. We capture an infinitesimal amount of it because it's so difficult. It's an aerial phenomenon, not a volumetric phenomenon like coal and oil. But 20 CMO is captured in total for growing all of the forest land, all of the basic growing stuff. We get 20 out of 17,000 coming in.
So So in that scale, what we're using is not gigantic, it's almost insignificant. And so if we could find a way, for instance, to split water into hydrogen and oxygen with sunlight, we might have some kind of handle on growing a hydrogen economy that would work.
Should I? All right. It's a great idea, but you're going to have to either have wind machines, photovoltaic panels, solar thermal, or nuclear power to generate the hydrogen. All the other schemes of making hydrogen from water without electricity don't seem to have many legs. And then hydrogen, the difficulty comes in handling the hydrogen, not the safety, but the fact that hydrogen is a very low energy density fuel, and you have to move it around one way or another.
Compared to natural
Hey,
gas,
There's a question back here. Do you want to see if you can get that?
very undense.
Do you have a microphone?
No, I just a wildflower role, so I'll just speak loudly. I come from the automotive industry, and I find this discussion very, very interesting. And I just wanted to make a couple of comments about some of the research that we're doing here, and that is...
Excuse me. Could you move your microphone, because otherwise people on the web will not be able to hear you.
That's okay. Again, I'm from the automotive industry, and we're looking at... I got it now. And I'm looking at energy-related topics. We're exploring clearly the fuel cell option, so methanol burning, hydrogen burning energy sources, and also just the future of mobility in general. So, what are our vehicles going to be in the future, and are they just, are vehicles going to be important in our society in the future? And instead of thinking of ways to reduce our energy consumption, we're looking at entire lifestyle changes, urban planning, everything, and just, car manufacturers are thinking very much in those directions. So, thankfully, because otherwise I would have an ethical problem working for the company I do. So.
You bring up a very interesting question, and it's a lifestyle question. We have turned in our affluent society to the suburbs. We've destroyed central cities. Would it be better, should we change our lifestyles and go back and live in more concentrated surroundings where transportation is much easier? You don't have to necessarily walk to your school or to your business, but you should have enough people in a traffic mode that you can use less energy than certainly use today. But incidentally, quite a different fact. Several years ago, I was looking at some aspects of energy efficiency, and I got some information from BART and from the metro system in Washington, and I found they were using more energy per passenger mile than the automobile, computer automobile, with 1.5 average passengers per car.
That's probably based on not a full.
Well, of course not. The metro in Washington, which I've used quite a bit, is not empty, but certainly not crowded in the daytime. And even in the nighttime, if you go out to the end of the line, you'll find 15 or 20 passengers on a vehicle. And wait, one other point. They run a lot of motive equipment, all those escalators running down and all the lights that are there for security really take up the energy. At least a third of the energy goes in operating stations.
Right, and one point with public transportation, things like Metro, if they don't run them frequently enough, you won't use them. As it is, I don't use Caltrain to go to San Francisco because if I miss one, it's 2 hours to the next one. That's not effective, even no matter how energy efficient it is.
Seems to me that, I'm back here, it seems to me that we've well identified that this problem is probably not going to be solved by anybody in this room. And so we're getting a little bit redundant, and it seems to me that maybe we ought to consider some of the approaches that Doug is suggesting, that we look at this more abstractly in a more thoughtful way as to how to, not how to solve the problem in specific, because we cannot do that, but perhaps how to accelerate the process of solving it and learning how to solve it.
And there's another basic question. I need to learn how to help dialogue going, so thank you. And do you have a comment to that?
Yes, I agree with that, because when I hear that this is identified as a big problem, and then I hear that the major player ought to be the oil companies who own the coal companies who own this and all that, as an individual I kind of feel that, hold on, let me finish my point. I feel that as an individual my interest gets all the way down to less than zero. And I'm just wondering if since we're talking about the process of dialogue, if there is a way to start to introduce or give voice to the consumer as a group. I mean, is the consumer well represented by any of those 12 groups on the chart, or by the oil companies? Or I'm likely to think that my voice is represented maybe by the media that may have a different spin on this entire problem. So how do we include the voice of the consumer as a real player at this table? That's my question about the process.
So that's great. That's what I'd like to see out of this and other big problems is, okay, what other secondary problems do you have to solve in order to get at this, which helps amplify the complexity of it to that. But it's, again, it's who's going to be smart enough to sort of offer the community the approaches that include all that secondary things. But it's
excuse me. My hand up for a long time here.
Sorry, I noticed on the television, on the video part of this thing, that I tended to go left and watch, see. So I'm sorry, the right wing over here.
Byron Hale. One of the reasons that I think that people don't like the idea of a nuclear solution is because of the fear of what might happen to those nuclear materials, and the fear of the political repercussions of that first fear. And I'm wondering, you know, as I sit here, whatever happened to mirrors in outer space? Why not move some of that real estate into outer space and do something like, say, focus some of that sunlight efficiently onto small areas?
Well, can't quite answer that. I know of some enthusiasts who devoted 20 or 30 years to the idea. You won't have as much mirror space requirement in space, truly. But how are you going to transmit the energy down? If we worry about a few eagles killed by windmills, how are we going to worry about all the birds that are going to get fried in a microwave? I'm just not a space enthusiast, I'm sorry. I think the problems on Earth are more severe.
Okay. I don't want to get in the habit of running over with what's the formal thing, so it's time now we close our sort of colloquium meeting, and feel free to get around and talk. Is there any compulsion about people getting out of here in any great hurry? Or is the management all left? I guess not. So we had thought, since last week it was so great to have a place where everybody could meet and be together and get some food, we had thought of trying to arrange for that sort of thing too. And a lot of people have been turned away who wanted to come to these meetings because the registration for it got full. And we thought that maybe that they could sit and watch the video close and come and talk. So anyway, some of the sort of exploring how the dynamics of interest and activity can go are very much of an interest to us. So if you want to stay around and talk and have any suggestions, we'd appreciate it. So otherwise, consider adjourned, and we'll solve the energy problem next week.